The year was 1945, and Europe was staggering toward an exhausted silence. Cities smoldered in ruins, their skeletal skylines jagged against a gray spring sky. The Third Reich, once bellowing with confidence, was breaking apart like glass underfoot. Columns of defeated soldiers trudged westward, boots caked with mud, helmets dangling at their sides in surrender. Amid this collapse, in the tangled countryside of central Germany, a small convoy of trucks rattled toward an improvised prisoner-of-war camp. Inside one of the trucks sat a dozen young women, each dressed in a uniform that no longer promised safety or belonging. They were clerks, radio operators, nurses, the overlooked auxiliaries of a regime now dead on its feet. The ride had been silent for hours. The only sounds were the groan of the engine and the clatter of loose rifles in the cab. Some of the women sat rigid, hands folded in their laps like schoolgirls awaiting discipline. Others leaned against the wooden walls, too weak to hold themselves upright. Hunger gnawed with a slow, methodical cruelty. They had not eaten in days. The retreat had been chaos, rations forgotten in the scramble to survive. Their commanding officers had vanished during the night, slipping away in cars with full tanks and little explanation. By dawn, the women were alone, abandoned, and easy prey for the advancing Americans. At the front of the truck sat a girl barely 20, her hair once pinned neatly under her cap now loose and greasy around her face. Her name was Anneliese Hartmann. A typist drafted into service in 1944, she had imagined safe offices far from the front lines. Instead, she had been shuttled across collapsing fronts, taking dictation for officers who barked orders they no longer believed in. She stared at her hands now, thin, pale, nails cracked, and tried not to think of home, of the orchard where she had played as a child. War had burned the sweetness out of such memories. Next to her, Greta Weiss rubbed her stomach, wincing as another hollow cramp twisted through her. Greta was older, perhaps 27, with sharp cheekbones that hunger had sharpened further. Before the war she had been a schoolteacher in Leipzig, her life modest but safe. When the call came for women to serve the fatherland, she had volunteered, half from patriotism, half from the need for a wage. Now her patriotism felt like an absurd costume she could no longer afford to wear. She glanced at Anneliese and managed a faint, brittle smile, an attempt at human connection in the void. The truck jolted to a stop. Voices outside barked in English, curt, commanding. The rear door creaked open, letting in cold air and the metallic scent of wet earth. A soldier gestured with his rifle, wordlessly telling them to climb down. One by one they descended, boots slipping in mud, eyes wary. Around them stretched a bleak field bordered by sagging barbed wire. A few makeshift tents flapped in the wind. Beyond them, a low building belched smoke from a crude chimney. American jeeps idled nearby, tires half buried in muck. The camp looked temporary, improvised, a holding pen thrown together in the wake of too many surrenders. The women stood together, huddled in their thin coats. The soldiers, young men with tired faces under steel helmets, watched them with a mix of detachment and faint curiosity. German men had poured into captivity by the hundreds of thousands, but women like these were rare. They didn't look like enemy soldiers. They looked like sisters, wives, daughters who had stumbled into the wrong story. An officer approached, his boots leaving deep prints in the mud. He was broad-shouldered, face shadowed by the brim of his helmet. His English orders snapped through the damp air. The women were to be registered, searched, then confined. Paperwork shuffled. Names were butchered by unfamiliar tongues. No translator stood ready. The war had moved too fast for protocol. Anneliese tried to answer when asked, but her German fell on deaf ears. In the end, they were pushed toward the fence, into a corner of the camp where a few tattered blankets lay on pallets. It was shelter in the loosest sense. Night fell quickly. The April chill was sharp, seeping into bones already brittle with hunger. Anneliese pulled her coat tighter, curling against the cold. Around her, soft weeping rose and fell. Greta whispered prayers under her breath, the words trembling but steady. Somewhere outside the wire, an American radio crackled with swing music, a jarring echo of a world that felt impossibly far away. Days blurred. No rations came. The camp seemed overwhelmed. Truckloads of prisoners arrived constantly, most of them men. Food was rationed with ruthless priority. The women were told little, spoken to less. Some GIs passed by with brief, puzzled glances, as if unsure what to do with these strange, defeated creatures in skirts and army boots. Annalise tried to keep her mind sharp by silently typing words in her head, names, dates, letters to no one. But clarity slipped each day. The hunger deepened. On the third night, Greta collapsed. It was quiet and sudden. One moment she was sitting, the next she had folded forward, her body hitting the dirt softly, like paper dropped to the ground. Annalise and another woman lifted her onto a pallet, shaking her awake. Greta's eyelids fluttered but didn't open. Someone whispered, "Wasser bit." But the water they had was a metal tin half filled with muddy rain. Annalise dipped a cloth and pressed it to Greta's lips. The older woman stirred faintly, then fell still. It was then that the American guard noticed. He had seen them before, of course, passing by on patrol, rifle slung lazily over his shoulder, eyes scanning more for trouble than for suffering. But now he stopped, his gaze sharpening. His name, though lost to records, we might imagine. Private John Miller, 22, farm boy from Indiana. He'd been drafted in 1944, had landed in France, trudged through the Ardennes. He was no stranger to hunger or cold. But this was different. These were not enemy officers with medals and defiance. These were exhausted girls, and one was unconscious on the floor. John lingered by the wire, the mud sucking at his boots. He watched Annalise brush hair from Greta's face with hands that trembled from weakness. For a moment he thought of his sister back home, 16 and proud when he'd left for the war. He thought of his mother, always scolding him for forgetting his coat. He thought of the sermons about mercy he'd half ignored as a boy. Orders said little about compassion. POWs were to be held, fed, processed. But orders also assumed a functioning supply line and clear command, neither of which seemed present here. The officers were busy. The cooks were stretched thin. And these women were starving. He felt an unfamiliar heat crawl into his chest. Anger, maybe. Or shame. He turned on his heel and strode toward the mess tent, where a few GIs lounged smoking. They looked up, amused, as he rummaged for leftovers. "What are you doin', Miller?" one asked, half laughing. John didn't answer. He found a dented pot of stew, mostly broth and gristle, and a loaf of bread hardened to rock. He wrapped what he could in a rag and returned to the fence. The women stared as he approached. His helmet cast his face in shadow, but his movements were careful, almost gentle. He unlatched a small side gate, just enough to slip through. The clink of metal made Annalise flinch. But she did not move away. John crouched beside Greta, set down the food. He gestured, "Eat." For a heartbeat no one moved. Then Annalise reached, hesitated, then tore a piece of bread and pressed it to Greta's lips. The older woman stirred faintly, her mouth opening like a reflex. Another woman dipped a spoon into the thin stew and offered it to her. Slowly, color touched Greta's cheeks. Quiet sobs broke among them, not from fear now but from relief so raw it hurt. John stood back, rifle slung loosely, watching. He said nothing until the first woman dared to meet his eyes. Then, in a low voice, he spoke the words that would stay with them forever. "Get up. You're coming with me." The night air held its breath. Annalise's stomach lurched. Was this rescue, punishment, interrogation? She couldn't tell. But the voice was neither cruel nor mocking. It was steady, urgent, and, impossibly, kind. Behind him, the camp smoldered with lantern light and distant orders. Ahead lay the unknown. And somewhere between those two worlds, a young guard had just chosen to defy indifference. The mess tent smelled of boiled coffee and damp wool, a scent that clung to everything in the American camp. John Miller stood just inside its canvas flap, his hands buried in his coat pockets, watching the cook scrape blackened stew from the bottom of a pot. His breath came slow and heavy. The image of the women behind the wire would not leave him, the hollowed faces, the girl with the ink-stained fingers trying to keep another alive. He told himself they were the enemy, that his duty began and ended at the fence. But duty, he was realizing, was easier to follow when it didn't stare back at you with eyes sunk deep from hunger. The cook, a corporal from Ohio with a perpetual smirk, caught him lingering. "What are you after, Miller?" he asked, ladle dangling. John hesitated, then said simply, "They're starving out there." The corporal frowned, not with cruelty but with a kind of weary pragmatism. "Everyone's starving, kid. Supplies tight. Orders say we feed 'em when we can." Then softer, "Don't stick your neck out. Not worth it." John didn't answer. He reached for the pot anyway, scraping what was left into a dented can, then found a wedge of bread hard enough to hammer nails. The corporal muttered something about trouble but didn't stop him. When John returned, the women were still clustered in their muddy corner, wrapped in blankets too thin to keep out the night. He stepped through the side gate again, the hinges groaning in protest. This time, they didn't flinch as hard. Annalise watched him with cautious intelligence, her eyes quick despite exhaustion. She said something soft in German. He didn't understand, but the tone was not hostile. He knelt again, placing the food on the ground between them, and motioned to eat. They moved with hesitant gratitude. A few whispered, "Danke," barely audible. Greta, though still weak, managed to sit upright and sip the broth. Her hands shook so badly the spoon rattled against the can. John found himself crouching beside her to steady it, though he kept his eyes low, as if worried about what might pass between them if he looked too long. He had guarded prisoners before, mostly men, sometimes defiant, sometimes broken. But these were different. They were young, unarmed, and had been left to rot in the confusion of a dying war. Later, alone at his post, John turned the problem over and over in his mind. The Geneva Convention was supposed to mean something. They'd been taught that. Prisoners were to be fed and treated humanely. But the war was collapsing into chaos, and supply lines cared little for ideals. Commanders looked the other way. Paperwork moved slower than hunger. He pictured his sister again. If the war had come to Indiana, if some enemy guard had seen her starving, would he have walked past? The next morning, he brought more food, bread and a small tin of beans he'd traded cigarettes for. The women ate in silence, but something subtle shifted. They sat straighter, met his eyes more often. Annalise, gathering courage, tried a few words of halting English. "Thank you." Her accent was heavy, but clear enough. John nodded, unsure how to reply. "You're welcome," he said quietly, though he doubted she understood. That day, while making his rounds, a lieutenant intercepted him. Tall, sharp, impatient, the man glanced toward the women's corner and frowned. "Miller," he said, "what the hell's going on there?" John's stomach tightened. "They're weak, sir. Haven't had rations." The lieutenant's eyes narrowed. "They're Germans. They'll live. You don't have orders to play nurse. Keep the fence secure and leave the feeding to supply." Then, after a beat, "And don't get soft. They'd have shot you without blinking 2 months ago." The words landed hard but not clean. John knew cruelty when he heard it, but he also knew the war had taught men to build walls around mercy. That night, John didn't sleep. The camp was restless. Trucks came and went, carrying prisoners to larger facilities. He sat by the fire with a few other guards, listening to them swap stories about girlfriends back home, about plans for when the war finally ended. No one mentioned the women. They were invisible to the machine of victory. Only when John stood to make his rounds did one of the older soldiers mutter, "Careful, kid. War's almost done. Don't go making it complicated." As he passed their corner, moonlight silvered the mud. The women were huddled close, sharing warmth. Annalise looked up at the sound of his boots. For a moment, their eyes held, tired blue meeting tired brown. She didn't smile. She didn't need to. Something quieter passed between them, acknowledgement, almost relief. He felt the weight of it settle into his chest, heavier than his rifle. By dawn, John had made a decision. He couldn't command supply lines or rewrite orders, but he could move. He could act. So when the officer of the watch changed, he requested permission to escort the prisoners for processing. The new sergeant, bleary and distracted, waved him off with a shrug. Paperwork was a formality now. The front had moved too fast for rules. That sliver of indifference was all John needed. He approached the women just after sunrise. Frost crusted the mud, and their breath hung pale in the cold air. He slung his rifle over his back and opened the side gate. The metal squealed softly. The women stirred, wary but alert. Annalise rose first, stiff and unsteady. He spoke in slow, plain English. "Come with me." He gestured toward the road leading away from the camp. His voice was calm, but there was urgency beneath it, the quiet insistence of someone acting against inertia. For a heartbeat no one moved. Then Greta, supported by two others, pushed herself upright. One by one, the women stepped forward, their boots squelching softly in the thawing ground. They looked like ghosts being coaxed back to life. John didn't rush them. He simply waited, scanning the camp to be sure no superior had taken notice. The sun rose higher, painting the field in pale gold. As they walked, John kept his eyes ahead. His pulse thudded hard enough to feel in his throat. Each step was a gamble. If an officer stopped him, if someone asked questions, there would be trouble. Maybe not a court-martial, but enough to stain his record. Yet with every glance back at the women, every glimpse of their gaunt faces lifting toward light and food and something like dignity, the risk felt strangely small. They reached the mess hall, quiet at this early hour. John ushered them in through a side entrance, out of sight from the main yard. The smell of bread and coffee hit like a wave. Some of the women trembled, the shock of real food after days of emptiness. John gestured to the tables. They sat cautiously, unsure if this was kindness or a trick. Then the first plate hit the wood, watery stew, but warm. Bread, soft this time. Coffee, black and bitter but life-giving. Slowly, fear gave way to hunger, and hunger to relief. Tears slipped down cheeks without permission. John stood back, watching. He felt no triumph, only a quiet steadiness, as if a moral ledger had shifted slightly toward balance. He thought of his mother again, of Sunday mornings and the quiet gospel about loving enemies. For the first time in months, he felt that teaching stir alive. But as the women ate, a shadow crossed the doorway. Boots thudded on the floorboards, deliberate, official. John turned, heart slamming. A figure filled the frame, the lieutenant from before, his expression unreadable in the dim light. The room fell silent, spoons halting midair. The fragile mercy John had built hung trembling, one breath from shattering. The lieutenant's shadow stretched long across the mess hall floor. For a moment no one breathed. The only sound was the faint clatter of a spoon slipping from Annalise's trembling hand. John Miller straightened instinctively, his boots snapping together, but he couldn't mask the flicker of fear in his eyes. The officer's gaze swept the room. The thin German women hunched over bowls, the steam rising from their first hot meal in days, the young guard who had dared to lead them here. "Private," the lieutenant said, voice flat, almost bored. "What is this?" John's throat tightened. His mind raced for a regulation, a loophole, anything that could justify what he'd done. "Sir, prisoners were malnourished. Geneva Convention says." "The convention says a lot of things," the lieutenant cut in, stepping closer until his boots were inches from John's. "It also says chain of command matters. You've got no orders to pull prisoners from holding." His eyes flicked to the women, an appraisal more than a glance, as if assessing livestock. Something in John's chest burned. "They were dying," he said quietly. For a heartbeat, silence held. Then the lieutenant exhaled, a long, tired sound. "War's ending, Miller. Don't tangle yourself in enemy misery now. Feed 'em fine, but don't play hero." He turned on his heel and left, boots drumming against the wooden floor. The door banged shut. The air he left behind felt thinner. John let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. The women watched him with wide, questioning eyes. Annalise tilted her head. A silent "what now?" He forced a small nod, unsure whether it meant reassurance or resignation. The lieutenant hadn't stopped him outright, but his warning was clear. Keep quiet, keep small, don't matter. That night, sleep refused John. He lay in his cot listening to the wind scrape the tent walls, replaying the moment over and over. The war was almost done. Germany had cracked open like a rotten shell. Soon he'd go home, a soldier with stories, maybe a medal, maybe not. Yet here he was, unable to walk away from a handful of starving enemy women. Why? Because they were young. Because he could see his sister's face in theirs? Because sometimes the smallest cruelty, the act of not caring, felt like betrayal itself? Across the yard, the women slept huddled together for warmth. Annalise stayed awake longer than the others, staring at the ragged tent ceiling. The food had steadied her, but fear lingered. She had learned quickly that survival depended on invisibility. She wondered what the young guard risked by helping them. She wondered if gratitude could ever cross the language gulf between them. The next morning, rumors rippled through the camp. Surrender was near. Trucks arrived to move prisoners to larger transit hubs. Paperwork was frantic, confused. Some guards grew sharp with nerves, others grew careless. For the first time, the camp seemed unsure of its own purpose. A jeep rolled up carrying Red Cross volunteers, women in gray coats with armbands. They moved briskly, checking records, inspecting rations. One stopped at the women's corner, spoke quick English to a sergeant, frowned at the conditions. There was talk of transferring them to a hospital facility, but then came the familiar shrug. No transport, no priority. The war was ending, and they were, in the words of one board clerk, just German girls. John overheard this exchange while standing guard. Anger flared, sharp and helpless. He had assumed once the Red Cross saw, things would change. But bureaucracy moved slower than compassion. These women could vanish in the shuffle, shipped somewhere worse, forgotten before peace was even signed. That afternoon he approached the fence again. The women stirred at his presence. Annalise stood, clutching her coat closed. He fumbled for German words, found none, then tried simple English. Soon, move. He gestured toward the trucks, mimed travel. Her eyes flickered with worry. She nodded slowly, as if bracing for another unknown. Inside the camp office, John asked where the women were bound. A clerk flipped papers carelessly. Some depot east. Could be days before they're processed. No food runs scheduled. Supplies stretched thin. The clerk didn't look up. Why? They your pets now. John bit down a retort and left before anger betrayed him. By evening, the sky was the color of ash. Greta sat propped against Annalise, her breathing steadier but still shallow. The youngest of the group, a girl no older than 16, hummed softly, a tune from home, fragile and defiant. John watched from a distance, heart heavy. He thought of his mother again. Do right when you can. You don't always get another chance. When darkness fell, he made his choice. He scrounged extra rations, filled a canteen, packed what small supplies he could take without notice. He couldn't stop the transfer, but he could make sure they didn't leave broken. He moved quietly, shadows his allies. Annalise startled when he appeared at the fence after lights out. His face was half hidden beneath his helmet, but his eyes burned with purpose. He pushed the supplies through a gap, gesturing urgently. Eat now, take for later. She understood. She mouthed, "Danke" again, this time with weight. Then he hesitated, and in that hesitation came a flicker of connection. He pointed at her, at the group, then to his own chest. He spoke slow, careful. Live. Okay. Live. She didn't know the word, but the meaning carried in his tone. She touched her chest and nodded once, fiercely. A sudden noise snapped the moment. Footsteps on gravel. John turned sharply to see another guard approaching with a lantern. The man paused, squinting. Miller? That you? John straightened, heart hammering. Just checking the wire, he said evenly. The other soldier grunted and moved on, lantern bobbing away into the night. John exhaled, then slipped back into darkness, leaving the women with bread and a faint spark of hope. The next morning, trucks growled to life. The women were loaded aboard, their faces pale but calmer than before. They clutched the food John had smuggled in, hidden under coats. Annalise turned once as the truck jolted forward. She found John standing by the road, rifle slung across his back, expression unreadable. Their eyes met for a fleeting instant, an unspoken farewell that carried gratitude, sorrow, and something like respect. Then the truck turned a corner and was gone. John stood long after the dust settled. Around him, the camp buzzed with activity. Officers shouting orders, men laughing about home, radios blaring news of surrender talks. But inside, something quiet had shifted. He had learned how thin the line was between duty and conscience, how easily war excused neglect. He didn't know if he'd done enough. He only knew he'd refused to do nothing. That night, as stars pushed through the dark, John wrote a letter he would never send. He addressed it to no one, maybe to his sister, maybe to history itself. He described the women, their hunger, their eyes, the small dignity of helping when no one else cared. Then he folded the page and tucked it into his pack. Some truths weren't meant for medals, they were meant to be remembered. Far down the road, the truck rattled toward an uncertain future. Annalise leaned against Greta, clutching the crust of bread like a talisman. She didn't know where they were going or whether safety waited. But she knew this: an enemy had seen her humanity. In a war that had stripped so much away, that recognition felt like survival itself. And somewhere behind them, in the fading hum of the departing convoy, a young American guard stood alone, aware that mercy had no uniform, and that the cost of silence might haunt him long after the guns fell quiet. The war ended not with a single explosion but with a long, weary sigh. Germany surrendered, the guns fell silent, and the world exhaled into uneasy peace. Yet for John Miller, silence did not mean rest. It meant memory, memories of mud and frost, of hollow eyes behind barbed wire, of a single morning when he chose to defy indifference. Back in Indiana, the spring smelled of plowed earth and rain-soaked barns. People lined the streets when soldiers came home. Bands played. Flags fluttered. John smiled for photographs, accepted pats on the back, but when asked about the war he spoke only of weather, rations, the mud. He never spoke of the women. Annalise, too, stepped into a new world that felt nothing like peace. The war's end did not free her, it merely reclassified her. As a former auxiliary, she was marked with suspicion. She and Greta were sent first to a processing center, then released into a Germany gutted and hungry. Cities were rubble. Food was scarce. Returning home meant whispers, Hitler girl, Nazi helper. She was 20 and already carried the eyes of someone much older. Yet within her, a strange, quiet resilience flickered. She remembered the American who had fed them when no one else did. She remembered his face, not heroic, just human, and clung to that memory like a slender bridge back to dignity. Years slid by. John married, had children, built fences, and planted corn. Nights were sometimes broken by small, restless hours. He would wake with the scent of diesel and mud still lingering, the echo of boots on gravel. He didn't regret what he had done, but he wondered if it mattered. History was large and impersonal. It devoured small kindnesses. His country told stories about victory and sacrifice, but not about quiet acts of mercy toward former enemies. So he kept his memory private, an ember he refused to let die but never shared aloud. For Annalise, survival meant rebuilding a self in a land of ruins. She taught herself to type again, worked as a secretary for an American-run office, careful, efficient, invisible. Greta, older but still fragile in health, lived with family nearby. They never spoke much about those final weeks of war. Silence was protection. But sometimes, when food was plentiful on the table, Greta would pause, close her eyes, and murmur, "Remember the boy?" Annalise would nod. Nothing more needed to be said. Decades later, history began to seek out the overlooked. Researchers from universities interviewed surviving German auxiliaries, recording their testimonies. Annalise, by then gray-haired and steady-voiced, spoke quietly of her capture, of hunger, of the moment a young guard broke rules to keep them alive. He said, "Come with me," she told a student with a tape recorder. It was not romantic. It was simply human. She didn't know his name. She had never known. But the memory glowed, untouched by time. John, old now and slowed by age, read newspapers about war anniversaries and documentaries on battles he'd fought in. They rarely mentioned the aftermath, the prisoners, the confusion, the strange limbo after victory. One night his grandson asked about the war for a school project. John paused, searching the boy's earnest face. He almost said it then, almost told of the starving girls, the risk, the lieutenant's warning. But the words caught in his throat. He feared they might sound self-serving, or too small against the grand narrative of tanks and triumph. Instead, he said softly, war teaches you what matters. His grandson didn't understand, but remembered the weight in his voice. The story might have ended in silence if not for one letter. It arrived unexpectedly, forwarded by a veterans group decades after it was written. Inside was a faded photograph of young American soldiers at a makeshift camp and a short note, typed carefully. If this reaches you, I was one of the German women prisoners in April 1945. I do not know your name, but I remember your kindness. You gave us food. You saved lives. I have lived a long life because of that morning. Thank you. It was signed simply, Anneliese Hartmann. John sat at the kitchen table, the letter trembling in his calloused hands. Outside, cornfields swayed in summer wind. He felt an ache, sharp, sudden, that was part joy, part grief. Someone had remembered. His small defiance had not been swallowed by history after all. He traced the signature with one finger, imagining the young woman she had been, the life she had built beyond that wire. He wished he could tell her that the act had mattered for him, too, that it had kept a piece of his humanity intact when war tried to strip it away. He stood slowly, letter in hand, and walked to the porch. The sun was sinking, gold spilling across the fields. For the first time in decades, he let the memory rise fully. The cold dawn, the rusted fence, the silent plea in Anneliese's eyes, the simple act of opening a gate. He realized he had spent years doubting if compassion could survive in the machinery of war. Now, with trembling clarity, he knew it could. Anneliese, somewhere in a small German town, placed her pen down after writing. She knew the letter might never find him, addresses faded with time. But sending it felt necessary, a thread thrown back across history's chasm. She thought of Greta, long gone now, and of the others who had shared that crust of bread. She thought of the man's voice, steady and kind despite the war. In the quiet of her flat, she whispered his memory aloud, one final time, as if to assure herself it had been real. Neither knew if the other would read or hear these last echoes. Yet in that fragile exchange, a soldier remembering, a former prisoner reaching across decades, the war's story bent, if only slightly, toward grace. And somewhere in the stillness between their distant homes, one enduring truth stood clear. Battles end, nations shift, empires fall, but a single act of mercy can outlast them all.